So we can start.
It's a pleasure to welcome you all. I'm not sure if we have to say good afternoon or good morning, because we are all around the world in this session. But I have to welcome you very warmly to the live session on the Hans Christian Andersen and his fairy tales course. We represent the Hans Christian Andersen Center, which is a part of University of Southern Denmark. And my name is Jos Nørgaard Fransen, and I'm the head of the Hans Christian Andersen Center. On my right is Professor Jakob Bøgil, and on my left is Dr. Torsten Bøgh Thomsen. Be welcome. We're now going to answer your good questions that you have sent us on mails and so on, and it's a pleasure trying to answer them in the best way. So the first one, or maybe you should say hello.
Hello. And welcome.
So they'll be familiar with your voice. And Torsten.
Hello, everyone. So good to be here.
The first question we'll try to answer is from Claire Lacey Hastings, and thank you very much for this question. You say, I think Jakob mentioned that as yet there has still not been a definitive translation of the tales into English. Where do these difficulties in translation lie? Are they generic difficulties with translation or specific to the Danish language? Do the translations into German offer a closer rendition because of the greater linguistic similarities in the languages? Jakob, will you try?
Yeah, I'll try. I think you can say that something is always lost in translation. That's inevitable. And the task of the translator is to make sure that as little is lost as possible. So there's this general difficulty about the business of translating. I don't think Danish necessarily offer greater difficulties than any other language when it comes to being translated. So we are dealing with difficulties of another kind in the case of Andersen, and we'll return to that with some of the questions to come. But it's a very good question about how about translating Danish and Andersen into German. I don't think that necessarily is any easier or more reliable, not necessarily. Maybe you could say that, or maybe I should say that I'm quite familiar with English translation. I've never done any research into German translations, so it's a bit speculative what I can say. But I think to some extent German grammar and syntax is more formalized than English and Danish grammar and syntax. So therefore, it's not a given thing that it's easier to translate Andersen into German than into English. And I should take very good care when I say that, but if you can talk about a language having a kind of sense of humor, then perhaps English is closer to Danish than German. But I'll not go deeper into that. But I wouldn't say that the task of the translator into English is more difficult than the task of any translator into German. That's not a given thing.
There might be some different traditions in England, in English and in German, reading Hans Christian Andersen. Maybe we'll come back to that.
That's a cultural difference.
Yes,
and
exactly.
It has nothing to do with the languages involved.
No, exactly. Yeah.
And one very, one essential question is whether the translator in any language starts from the premise that this is children's literature,
yes,
for example.
Exactly.
That's much more decisive.
Yeah. So would you say that to return to the question, so you would tend to say that the difficulties with translation are kind of generic and not specific to the Danish language?
they're not specific to the Danish language. Some problems are, you could say, specific to Andersen.
Yeah.
And I think we'll return to them.
Yes, yes. Well, that's because of use of irony and so on, but we'll return to that.
Yeah, and other
more than one time.
Other anomalies.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. So thank you so much for your question, Claire Lacey Hastings. Now we're going to a question from Yuri de la Peña. Also on the subjects of translation, I was wondering why you choose John Irons' translations over Jean Hirschhold's for this book. Maybe you should try that.
Yeah, Yuri also mentions that the English translations you can access via the center webpage. That's Hirschhold's translations.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, sorry.
So that's a very good question. If you, as in this case, if you give access to translations of the oeuvre of a writer, be it fairy tales or short stories or whatever, it's always an advantage if the translations, if they have been made by the same translator. And the case is, I think it was around 1940, something like that. Hirschhold did his translations, and he translated almost all of the fairy tales and stories. So you had a complete set by the same translator, and I think that's the main rationale behind his being the ones you can access via the webpage. A newer translator that, like Haugaard, has almost translated almost all of the fairy tales and stories, but then you might run into problems with copyright and all that. So Hirschhold was pretty complete, and he was kind of accessible.
Yeah.
And therefore he was chosen. In fact, you can find grave inadequacies in his translations, and that's why we preferred to have new ones made for this course. Yes. Because we simply couldn't make do with Hirschhold's translations.
Oh yeah, and that's the explanation of the John Irons translations, because that's the new ones we're having made at the moment. So these are brand new translations that we're having done to supplement or replace the ones that we have replace the ones we have on the website.
And maybe every generation have to do its translation, because
that's a very deep question. What is the durability of a translation? I think John Irons' translations will be able to stand the test of time for quite a while.
We'll look forward to it.
Hopefully.
Yes. Yeah. And here's a question from Annette Hobbs. And my question is about translation. So that's another question in translation. Is much lost in the nuances of meaning, so we English speakers might have a different understanding of a story than a Danish speaker. I noted in my 1950s version of The Snow Queen, the devil is translated as the evil gnome. Devil somehow links the story with Christianity compared with gnome, which immediately makes it a fairy tale, whilst devil leaves more doubt. Torsten, are you?
I think is it true that it's actually troll in the original one? I can't remember, or is it?
I think Annette is mentioning one specific translation.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you know there are numerous English translations.
But it's the one from the beginning, right, with the mirror.
It's from the very beginning.
One she means. Yeah. But in the Danish, I can't remember if it's devil or troll.
It's a troll.
Yeah, it's troll.
So it can be translated by ogre or troll.
Yeah, exactly.
Gnome is not a very good.
No, and I think even devil is a stretch, because it doesn't actually in the Danish have these Christian connotations that the devil would have.
In fact, the Danish way of saying the devil would be djævelen.
Yeah.
But in Andersen's version, it's djævlen. Yeah, and this is a kind of colloquial way of referring to the devil. So you might even, as a translator, wonder, should you translate with something like Old Nick? for example.
Oh yeah,
exactly. Exactly.
Because the same kind of colloquial reference to the devil,
which complicates it even further. That even in Danish, the actual word is really complex and difficult to and can generate a lot of different meanings. I am not sure that it is that the question reads is much lost in the nuances of meaning, so we English speakers might have a different understanding of the story than a Danish speaker. I don't think that only applies to English speakers. No. I'm reminded of a funny incident a couple of years ago, I think it was, when we had a visit from some Russian Andersen scholars, and they wanted to ask me if it's true that in the Emperor's New Clothes that he is running around in the street naked. Because in the Danish original it says he had nothing on, and that's what the child is shouting. He has nothing on, but it has actually been translated early into Russian as he's naked. Yes. So in all the Russian depictions of the emperor, you will see him completely naked, whereas in the Danish he would have these undergarments on this typically, because in the 19th century, saying that somebody was undressed was not the same as saying they were naked. They were just weren't properly dressed somehow. Exactly. Yeah. So. And that's just one example. Another one is the fact that the Princess and the Pea was in the beginning translated as the 3 Ps in English. So you will see some illustrations to the Princess and the Pea where there are 3 Ps, because for some reason they multiplied when translated into English. So it can, I mean, my point is that it's not just a thing concerning the translation from Danish to English. There will always be some kind of slips or some kind of meaning that is somehow, sometimes you can generate some meaning and sometimes you can reduce some meaning that's actually much more complex in the original, or you can generate some more complex meaning than there is in the original. So I think that it goes with all kinds of translations.
Yeah. I think there's a general aspect about this question, and then there's a specific one about the beginning of the Snow Queen.
Yeah.
Because one thing you can say generally is that Andersen is very often playing on Danish idioms and sayings, and sometimes in inventing idiomatic phrases himself. But some of these will be almost impossible to translate. Exactly. And therefore something will be lost. Inevitably.
And the sentence. I'm sorry. Yeah.
And then about the beginning of the Snow Queen, I think this is a very good observation in this question. I mean, what is at stake here, and what is being mixed? And it starts in the way that, like, you know, hey ho, or now look, now we begin. When we get to the end, we'll know more than we do now, because it was an evil troll or ogre. It was, in fact, the devil, or it was the devil. Oh, yeah. So you have this mixture. Yeah. Andersen makes this mixture of the devil belonging to the realm of Christianity, but the colloquial term dævlen, and then you've got the ogre or troll belonging to folk mythology. So Andersen is mixing two, you could say, world views in this opening sentence, for very good reason, because these are layers in, or spheres in the story. And interpreting the story is very much about finding out how to deal with these two spheres, how they interact in the story. So Andersen is perfectly aware of doing that. Whereas the translator might think, this is strange, the children won't understand, I'll change it. Yeah. So the translator will be completely unaware of the level Andersen is operating at. And I think that's happened with quite a lot of English translations.
Yeah, and I think that's if you could talk of a tendency, then maybe that's what's happening, that some kind of ambiguity in the original text is lost because the translator settles on one or the other meaning of an ambiguous word.
Yeah. And the sentence, it has got nothing on in Danish, that doesn't necessarily refer to the clothes, but it has nothing on.
Oh,
it's
a
bit stupid.
Yeah,
it might be
a metaphor.
It might be naked for the world in another way. Yeah. So yeah, okay. And here's a question from Haley Miller, and it says, Hans Christian Andersen's writing style seems so easily accessible, even now, long after he wrote them, that I was wondering if there was anything that has been lost over time due to translation. Were any characters or elements changed to suit different countries from the originals? Maybe you have been around some of it.
Yeah. Well, one thing you can say is that we do have access to the complete original wording of Hans Christian Andersen. So at least from the Danish part, there's nothing that's somehow lost. We haven't received this from ancient Norse or something like that. It's only been 200 years, so we know the exact wording of the text.
Yes. Yeah.
But I think it's correct that there is an issue about translating Andersen into other cultures than Western Christian culture, and we haven't done any research into that area, but I think you will find that certain things will be changed in order to make things understandable in a different cultural context.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, words are changing what they mean sometimes. Yes.
Yeah, that's also a thing. You have to in order to understand the Danish text, at least, probably you also have to understand the mindset when it was written and what the different words meant when they were written. And we often have very, very particular discussions about the workings of one particular word in a sentence. What does this one tiny word actually means, or what did it mean back then? Because the meanings might have shifted a bit.
Yeah. Maybe we should go to some of the questions up here. Well, there's a question saying, I think it's Pat Patterson. I'm interested in the life story of Hans Christian Andersen and how his early history and that's good. And how his early history and travels affected his writing. For instance, did his family tell him or read fairy tales to him? What shaped his writing career, and how was his work received? Well, we know of his father. His father died when Hans Christian was 11 years old. The father told, actually, stories, fairy tales for him. We know that he, in that manner, came from a storytelling family. So he had something from his childhood. Yeah. And it's a question is also about traveling. Well, all of his life, he was traveling, and a lot of his writings reflects his traveling.
Yeah,
Europe around, Denmark around, and traveling also within himself, you might say.
Yeah, I think it's when he's 14 he moves to Copenhagen, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and you will find in a lot of his writings, actually, you will find that story reflected of a young, creative, talented boy moving to a city, trying to make it, having some trouble doing that. I think that's a repeated storyline in some of his texts. But it's also a function of the artistic environment he's in. Those kind of stories were popular at that time.
My life is a fairy tale, he said.
Yeah.
He was traveling into this fairy tale, making fairy tales by traveling. So traveling reflected.
And constantly writing on his travels and writing different, writing things down in his diary, or just little pieces of nature description, which he would later then work into some story of some kind. So he was, I think it's safe to say that it was a really incorporated way of his life, that he would just write as he went along, and incorporate some of it into his works, and some of it he would leave out.
So traveling and living and making arts were in a way one thing.
Yeah.
we return to these questions? I think there are a few clusters of questions.
Oh yes.
So
let's do that.
Might do wise to stick to the sequence.
Yes, I think you're right. So here's a question from Carrie Bassett. Is there any reason why the course designers didn't choose to include what I think they call a thing fairy tale? It isn't one not about a human, such as the fir tree or the daisy or the steadfast soldier. Maybe that's you, Torsten.
Yeah, I can. Well, at least I can say what I've thought about our selection of fairy tales, because I understand the question to the extent that I really love the fairy tales of things. I think they're excellent, and I would have enjoyed introducing one of them. But I think that the arguments that we wanted, or the thing that we wanted to do with this selection of fairy tales, as I recall it, is that we wanted to introduce people to some of the more complicated fairy tales that are also puzzling us a lot. And to some extent, I think that although I adore the fairy tales of things, I think that they sometimes are, that they're very succinct. They're typically quite small and somehow very crisp. I'm not saying they're not complicated, because they are very complicated. But I think that the ones that we found are complicated in a way that they show some really deep existentialist problems. I'm thinking particularly of the story of a mother and the mermaid and the Snow Queen.
I think we should maybe add that what we in the Danish literary context refer to as the fairy tales of things are actually the stories about things.
Mm-hmm.
And for example, not the fir tree or the daisy.
Oh yeah,
exactly. Because they're stories about growths.
Yes.
So stories about material things, that's the fairy tales of things. And we could indeed have been, if you think along the lines of the home away home structure, you could indeed include the steadfast tin soldier or the shepherdess and the chimney sweep. But I think we went for also the culturally complex fairy tales, which would also test the universality of Andersen's tales, and that's why we moved in the direction of, you know, the Christian aspects, motifs of stories like the story of a mother, the Snow Queen, and the Red Shoes. Yeah.
Which is on this week is
on the Red Shoes.
The Red Shoes is right now.
Yeah.
So yeah, and as I recall,
it's a very good question.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think to just get the last one with the one we start with, Futile, I can't remember it right now.
Tinderbox.
The Tinderbox. Yes. I think we chose that one because it was it was one of the first fairy tales he did, and it also really well illustrates this. Where he's diverting from the actantial model and it shows really well how he uses and changes the model from the original fairy tale model, the folk tale model.
Yeah. Carrie Bassett asked another question, Torsten. If your PhD is about Hans Christian Andersen, could you very easily and very short explain what it's about?
Yes.
You haven't got many seconds.
I know. Yes, it is, and yes, I would love to. It is about Hans Christian Andersen, and I am a PhD student or doctoral student focusing on nature, views on nature, and the representation of nature. Within the field that's called eco-criticism. So what I do briefly is that I'm doing a rereading of parts of Hans Christian Andersen's authorship with focus on how the representation of nature changes from in the beginning of a quite romantic nature onto a nature that's more informed by natural sciences. So that's a really brief explanation.
That was a brief, yes.
Yeah.
And you're also working on the fairy tales of things.
Yes,
exactly.
And I'm working specifically with the fairy tales of things, but I was gonna come back to that in a second because we're being asked what's our favorite Hans Christian Andersen.
Yeah, we'll look forward to that. And then there's a third question from Carrie Bassett. Could you talk about how Freudian psychoanalytic theory has been used to interpret the tales, please? Would you like to do that, Jacob? About the
because Freudian psychoanalytic theory has been used in order to interpret Andersen's tales and stories on a number of occasions, and almost always with a biographical angle or aspect. And personally, I find that quite a reductive approach, and I think that has been the case with most of the attempts made in that direction so far, because the result almost always is that really it's all about the author and not very much about what he wrote. So I like the approach where you, at least to begin with, forget about the author, because that makes sure that you actually read what's in front of you.
Yeah, and it makes sure that you always consolidate your arguments in the text rather than in some kind of notion of the biographical author, which always somehow gets really speculative. I usually, in my teaching, I usually refer to it as the ugly duckling trap, which is when one biographical reading becomes so canonical that you tend to think that this story actually cannot be understood at all if you're not referring to the biography of the author. And I think that's a really reductive move, when you make the biographical life of the author the only explanation for the text. And I think that's what happens a lot when you read biography. That's the risk when you read biographically.
Exactly.
And I think it's worth mentioning that one of the first, Freudian analytic theoretical interpretations made of an author was Marie Bonaparte's interpretation of the tales of horror of Edgar Allan Poe. And she'd been analyzed by Freud, and she was the granddaughter of Napoleon Bonaparte, I think. So quite a story. But she wrote this book on Poe and his tales from a Freudian point of view, and I think she sent it to Freud, and Freud was absolutely shocked. And he said, no, this is wild psychoanalysis, you can't do this. So that was Freud's own reaction to a study like that.
I do, this is maybe a bit anecdotal, but I do believe that he was actually subjected to those biographical readings in his own lifetime, wasn't he? And criticized for I don't know, not being, well, in the first one by Kierkegaard, it was not being coherent enough, or having a proper coherent worldview.
Yeah, and lacking in, artistic distance.
Yeah, so he was too involved,
What we are served is not a production by the author, but an amputation of the author, was Kierkegaard's not very kind characterization.
So even back then, I think, he was subjected to these biographical readings, and maybe you could say that he also sometimes invited not biographical readings, but some kind of interest in his person, in his own person, by writing autobiographies from a very, very early age, and constantly, I don't know.
No, he put himself on a stage. So
he wasn't afraid of the spotlight.
No,
to say the least.
You might say so. Yeah. And here's a question from Annette Hobbs. I've just read the Guardian article from 2006. I'd like to know how the Hans Christian Andersen Center regards this perspective on Hans Christian Andersen. As the weeks have gone, I'm reminding of Lewis Carroll.
Well, I've read that article. I haven't read it before, but I have seen the content of it many times before. It's an article that links the works of Hans Christian Andersen very closely with his presumed repressed homosexuality, bisexuality, some kind of repressed sexuality. And along the lines of the earlier question, I think it's very problematic reading in that way, partly because we know very, very little about Hans Christian Andersen's sexuality or lack of sexuality. We do know that he, according to himself, was in love a couple of times, and we do know that he wrote some very, very passionate letters to some of his male friends. Letters that were perhaps even more passionate than you would expect in the 19th century, even though male people were very, very generous and complimentary towards each other back then in their letters. But that's really all we know. Yeah. And it's really difficult to link all this very, very small piece of biographical knowledge to this enormous amount of work. Also, when we know it, the thing is, I don't want to reduce Hans Christian Andersen to some kind of symptom, or his works to some kind of symptom of a problem. I think that's a really, I think that's a grave reduction of the work of this really, really intelligent, artistic person, to reduce his work to some kind of symptom of some malfunctioning sexual life. I think that's a banalization and a reduction, and based on all the things we know of how deliberately he and how seriously he took his work and how deliberately he worked, I just can't make that sync up with the notion of. But I think there is this interest in, sometimes it can be tempting to romanticize all of these artists as either crazy or in possession of some kind of repressed sexuality or somehow really odd persons. But I think we should be wary of that, this sensationalist interest in their private lives, of which we know very little, basically.
Yeah, and perhaps you could compare Andersen to Lewis Carroll in a completely different sense, in the way that their artistic imagination works. For example, and their relationship to language and everyday language. I mean, with Lewis Carroll, you've got the saying, idiom, mad as a hatter, and suddenly you have a mad hatter as a character in Alice in Wonderland. Or you got a dish like mock turtle soup, and suddenly you have a character like a mock turtle. And in a way, that's the way that Andersen's literary mind works too.
Some kind of Gothic way of writing.
No, taking language at its word.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. But we know that this, with love, that Hans Christian Andersen in the late 1830s declared that love, physical love, wasn't him. His love, his experience with love would be in the fairy tales. So he thought of denied physical love.
Yeah,
that we do know that. Yes,
but it's really to say, because sometimes in the comments it comes up if we're deliberately avoiding this question, which seems so pertinent somehow, and I can assure you it's not because we're being prudish or in any way avoiding this. If we knew that it had some kind of relevance, then perhaps we would introduce it into the readings, but as it is, we just don't have the knowledge to support that. And we are willing to incorporate his travels, for example, in analysis of his works, because it seems really relevant, and there are a lot of other things that support readings like that.
Yeah, and you could say we do not know very much about the life of William Shakespeare. So his plays and sonnets will have to stand on their own 2 feet, and they prove to be very, very able to do that.
And doing that very well.
Allow the work of an author to stand on its own 2 feet.
Definitely.
When it's able to do
but
so.
Andersen, well, he told about himself again and again and again, and that's why it's difficult not to look at the biographies.
Yeah, but that would you could do that from another angle, then. I think, because it's an author using using him or herself.
Haley Miller put a question. Okay, yes. Do you believe Hans Christian Andersen's sexuality? played a part in his unpicking religion and graphic depictions of violent elements. I think his stories may have been the root of my love of horror films, which often use fear and gore to discuss social issues.
Well, I'm surprised and delighted to see that someone actually took the horror of, maybe that is the Tinderbox. That's the most, I think, the most horrific one we've had on the course, but is really seeing something fantastic in it. I think that's delightful. I don't think that Hans Christian, because we are very unsure of Hans Christian Andersen's sexuality or lack thereof, I don't think it played a part in his unpicking religion. I think it has more to do with some currents in the time that he was living in. There were a lot of hot theological discussions that he incorporated into his texts. So I don't think it's a personal pathological motivation, but more a broader cultural motivation of the culture he was embedded in, and a lot of the things that were going on in there at that time.
I mean, what we do know is that Andersen remained an outsider, or felt that he was an outsider, and never totally accepted. And his social background set him apart, and perhaps his sexuality.
Yeah.
But the result was that he was able to be in the position of an observer, a very, very acute observer of his time, of social interaction. And he was a kind of seismograph at many levels. And of course, that he can use in order, or he could use in order to create what he did.
And I think if I should venture, but this would be a very bold move for me, but yeah, I think I hadn't thought about it in that light, but I think you're absolutely right. And if had he married and somehow become part, like a really integrated part of the bourgeoisie, it would have been difficult for him to stay as ambiguous and universal throughout his writing career.
Yeah, and there's a parallel in Søren Kierkegaard. That's the same thing. Yes. Well, Haley Miller puts another question. I think we'd love to answer that. Well, we do love to answer all these questions, but Haley Miller asks, which story was the first you remember reading, and which is your favorite one now? And then she says, thank you in advance. I'm really enjoying the course. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Well, I might be the strange case here, because I don't think Andersen was read aloud to me when I was a child. So I can't really remember which was the first one that influenced me or in my childhood. The first one I really worked with was The Little Mermaid. And that will always be a favorite for that reason, but I think that I've got 4 absolute favorite stories, and that's The Story of a Mother and The Snow Queen, for sheer brilliance and complexity. And then The Shadow and Haunted Toothache. And I simply can't choose between these. And were I to pick 4 favorites, I would be able to do it, and that would be those 4.
Yeah, oh, it's okay. I don't remember. I'm the same. I don't remember what the first story was. I think it might be Little Claus and Big Claus, but I'm not sure. I think Andersen always was there. The fairy tales has always been there in a way. So which one was the first? I don't know either. The favorites, well, Jacob, I wouldn't be a mirror of you, but I think I agree. The Little Mermaid, I think that's perfect. You can read it again and again and again, and you never got enough. And the Snow Queen, yeah. There's a lot of stories.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Well,
Little Mermaid, I think that's the top.
I'm in total agreement with you guys. I can't remember a time when I didn't know these stories. They were read aloud to me when I was a child, and I can't remember not knowing the stories. So I really don't remember which one was the first I remember reading. But my favorite right now, and I'm going to have to agree with you guys, is The Little Mermaid by far. And that's the first one I actually have a remembrance of my mother reading aloud to me, because she did that before we went to see the Disney version in the cinema. So I was 6 years at that time, and that's my earliest memory of someone reading aloud to me, and I was completely surprised by the ending. And I still love that that story. I think it's a masterpiece. I think it's brilliant. But I have this newfangled adoration of the fairy tales of things, the shepherdess and the chimney sweep, the steadfast tin soldier. I think they are, because they are so short and so well composed, and so somehow there's a stringency when it comes to the fairy tales of things that I really love. But yeah, I'm gonna have to say The Little Mermaid as well.
Yeah. But you're right that the short ones, they have a very special way of being.
Yeah.
Princess on the Pea. It's one page, almost, and there's a universe.
Exactly.
There's a whole world inside it.
I'm amazed by how much can be told by one single piece of one sheet of paper.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. And then there's a question by Jo McBay. Before this course, I had to read Hans Christian Andersen stories since I was a child. Before this course, I had not read Hans Christian Andersen stories since I was a child. I had not remembered the Christian references in them. Was his desire to refer to Christian teaching in his stories from a personal devotion? An idea it might make his new fairy tales more popular among the people of his day, or perhaps working out his own beliefs?
I think the final formulation is very much spot on. That I think, I mean, Andersen was a Lutheran Protestant Christian somehow, but what does that mean? I think on a personal level, he was also curious, searching. So his testing out different perspectives on Christianity in different stories. So I think he's very much also working out his own beliefs, but also discussing, you could say, cultural ideas. Because it's another thing you have to remember is how the whole mental map of the age was changing. And again, Andersen being the seismograph that he was, you know, reading the Bible not as the word of God, but as a historical document written at a specific time in history. That kind of study, the philological, hermeneutical study of the Bible, was initiated at this time, at the same time as the natural sciences offered other explanations of various things. So all this was debated, discussed at Andersen's time, passionately, and so there's the personal side to it, and there's the cultural element that the whole mental map was being reorganized at this time in history.
Yeah, Christianity became a sort of cultural Christianity, you might say, in these years.
It was certainly in this mental environment. It was certainly not. Yeah, I think it's very important to keep in mind that Christianity was not just one thing at this point in time, and it was not that central institution in society that it used to be, and it was very much contested. So to answer the first part of the question, I definitely don't think that it was an instant career move to tap into Christian themes or incorporate them. So that's probably not why it was done. However, it turned out to be a career move to tapping into the fairy tale genre at this point in time. So I would say kind of,
because a market had emerged.
Yes. And there were special themes in Christianity, as love conquers all, that Andersen was interested in, you might say. Yes, and then there's a question from Annette Pigman. Is the story of the mother a well, what's that word? Euthanasia, I'm sorry, or a pro-life story? This is perhaps a continuous question, but is this a case of a mother believing in life at any cost? Maybe that's you, Shaq.
Yeah. It's a difficult question, because we are now quite familiar with debates on abortion, euthanasia, and so on. These were not debates of Andersen's time. So Andersen wouldn't directly address such questions. As I've suggested in some of the discussion threads in relation to the story of a mother, I mean, you can read it in different ways, as an allegory of the work of mourning, which it certainly is. So how do you deal with death when it has happened? How do you deal with the inevitability of death? But the mother does certainly not believe in life at any cost. I would say that's at least that's not what's depicted in the story. What's debated, and that you could relate that back to the former question. What is the implication of faith in God when faced with something like death? That's an issue in the story, and what the answer is, that's very complex. There might not be one definite answer, but the story ends with the mother accepting what has happened as the will of God.
Yeah, I'm not principally opposed to those kind of anachronistic moves where you take something from the past, an artwork, and make it say something about the present time. You should just be very aware that you're not saying something about the artwork in itself, that it's not the artwork that is then pro-life or anything, but it is construed in this configuration that you're making. You are demanding some kind of you're demanding some kind of thing from the artwork in a contemporary context that the artwork was never designed to respond to. So I would be wary of.
Yeah, I think you could say that there are some questions implied by a story like the story of a mother, which you might somehow address or find inspiration in when discussing pro-euthanasia or pro-life abortion and so on.
Yeah.
So the story can always work as a source of inspiration for present ethical debates.
Sure.
But that's something completely different.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And then we have got a good question from Annie Wagstaff. My question is about clothing and footwear. They often play a role in Hans Christian Andersen's stories. There's Gerda's red shoes, the red shoes in the red shoes, their boots, muff, and large borrowed gloves. To what extent is this derived from traditional fairy tales? Maybe that's a question for you.
Well, I can certainly try, because now we have the red shoes on for this week, which is
yes.
The one I'm instructing. And in that one, footwear certainly plays a large role as some kind of extension of the person. The person, in this case, it's Karen, the protagonist, is very much, well, she reflects her personality through her choice of clothing. So as an extension of the person, these items, of course, work in that way. And Yeah, they often play a role, elements of clothing and garments in Hans Christian Andersen's stories. I think that it's to some extent is derived from traditional fairy tales where items always somehow seem to play some kind of role. The exchange of items, or particularly golden items, are always featured, and combs and instruments and things like that always appear somehow in the folk tales. Instruments often appear when a person is showing emotions. The person is sometimes playing a flute or a harp or something like that. I don't know, in the particular case of footwear, I don't know exactly how that fits in, because it works very particular in the red shoes, and somehow also well, Goethe is kind of using them as payment.
Payment or a sacrifice, I would rather say, to the river.
Yeah.
And it appears that the river rejects the sacrifice.
Yeah.
Because they're washed up on the shore again.
Yeah.
And Gerda thinks she didn't throw them far enough, so she moves out to this little boat. And then the boat loosens itself from the bank, and suddenly she's embarked, literally, on her quest. But the river never accepts the shoes as a sacrifice.
But maybe you could say that the shoes are often a metaphor or a stand-in for something else. They typically signify some kind of exchange, or reflects the vanity of the person wearing them, or something like that. In one particular case, the garment is actually really interesting, as I recall it, which is also from the Snow Queen. The hat of the old lady who knew magic has all these kind of illustrations and embellishments. And there, I think that the garment somehow takes off and into its own digression somehow from the plot, or it turns into something completely different than just an item of clothing.
But I think to invest clothing with meaning is something deeply ingrained in human culture, and I think that Annie is completely correct that this is reflected in folk and fairy tales. Cinderella.
Oh yeah.
All kinds of fur. But again, Andersen will use this element to his own ends. So I think The Red Shoes and the Snow Queen, these two stories were written 1845, both of them. And what's the relationship between Gerda and Khan, between the Red Shoes of Gerda and the Red Shoes of Khan? Because I'm sure Andersen had some kind of connection or contrast in mind. So that's left for us as readers to contemplate.
And then there's a question from Antonia Kretny. She says, probably because I have rather rushed through the material, I feel that there are some ideas which I never really got to grips with. However, I'm grateful for the enlargement of my previously very limited knowledge of Andersen and the fairy tale genre. One thing we didn't touch on was the place of folk and fairy tales in the emerging nationalism of the 19th century. Does this approach have any relevance to Andersen, I wonder?
I think that's a good question, and I think you can say that there are two tendencies or movements within the larger Romantic movement. One which is nationalistic, and I think it's or nationalist, and I think it's true that gathering or collecting folk tales and making sure they were written down had to do with an interest in the history of the people and national culture, not as the nation state, but as, you know, the people. I think that is true, but there's also a universalist or a universal tendency or trend in early German Romanticism. And I think Andersen is more of a universalist than he's a nationalist.
Yeah, very much so. I remember a certain passage in, is it called Only a Fiddler, Just a Fiddler in English?
Just a Fiddler.
Just a Fiddler, where the one of the protagonists, Naomi, she is somehow reprimanded by her aunt, saying, how come you don't like this country? Don't you like this country? And she says, yes, I like this country. I think it's beautiful. And I think I would like it even more if other people weren't so busy telling me it's beautiful all the time. And I also know that the climate is horrible here. So I think, yeah, I think that is a really anti-nationalist gesture that Andersen is somehow putting in there. Not that he's an anti-nationalist himself necessarily, but I think he has a problem with this really, really sentimental nationalism of that Romanticism could also present.
Or maybe the word nationalism just doesn't fit to him because he had this universal way of seeing it. But he loved Denmark.
Yes, of course he did. He did.
Danish, but there's a world around Europe. Europe was there.
But the notion of the notion of world literature derives from Goethe and the early Romanticists in Germany, and that's Andersen's orientation. He would have liked maybe he saw his literature as, or what he wrote as, part of world literature, and not as merely Danish literature. Yeah, exactly. So so all of his ideas were European more than Danish in a way. Yes. Then there's a question from Stephen Doherty. The way we perceive fairy tale universally today, because of Disney's interpretations, etc., can be seen as now being deviated from the endings in Hans Christian Andersen stories, like the Little Mermaid and the Snow Queen, the one called Frozen. Why do you think Hans Christian Andersen didn't write them this way? Well, that's a good question, isn't it? Very good question. And I don't know if you can give a general answer to that question. I mean, you can say something about, the Snow Queen. I mean, the apparently very strange ending where you do not have a final showdown with the antagonist. I mean, it does imply a whole idea about the world, that evil isn't conquered once and for all. The splinters are still flying around. The Snow Queen is still out there somewhere. And that's a statement in itself.
Yeah.
And likewise with the Little Mermaid, the aspiration was not for after all, primarily for the prince and living happily ever after. There's something beyond that. So I think you have to be specific about these two stories, why Andersen chose the endings that he did. And they are endings which wouldn't really make do for Walt Disney, probably.
No.
Yeah.
But there seems to be some kind of resistance towards this really happy ending. I think even when it could happen somehow. I think of the shepherdess and the chimney sweep. When they return, it somehow seems to be a happy ending, but it's like the author can't help himself making it really weird and unpleasant somehow. It says that they are standing there until they fell apart or something like that, which is a really... They do not live happily ever after. They stand there.
They return to their claustrophobia.
Exactly. So it's a home away home, but getting home is actually the bad part. And it actually, the narrator directly says that to us, that was wrong. He says that explicitly to us, the readers, that it's a bad ending, even though he could have framed it as a good ending. Likewise, the steadfast tin soldier, had he only embedded the sparkle in the melted tin, then it would somehow have made some kind of synergy, or there would have been some kind of harmony at the end, but it's not. The sparkle is left on the side and it's almost burned to a singe. It's completely blackened. So there seems to be this resistance towards a happy end.
Yeah, the happy ends are exceptions.
Yeah.
Like Thumbelina.
Yeah.
The Wild Swans is a kind of happy end story too.
Yeah.
But then the happiest ending of all is the ending for the Shadow in the Shadow, and he's the really dubious, shady character. So the Shadow is also a very strong statement
Yeah.
So I'll just recommend that story. You should read The Shadow.
It's really, yeah.
With special, take special notice of the home away home structure.
Exactly.
In how it works in a double sense in that story. That's also a masterpiece.
There's a lot of masterpieces. I'm not sure how many questions we can get through. Time very soon running out, I think. But there's a question from Lena Postlewhite. There are many Christian motives in Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales, and at least some of them seems to question the values of Christianity. How much is known about his own attitude towards Christianity? Well, I think
it reflects back on a question we've already discussed. I think it's very true to say that they question the values of Christianity. They don't deny them, they don't go against them, but they question values. As they say, Andersen is trying to see things from different perspectives, test out various positions, and is asking questions all the time.
Yeah,
and I think that's very true.
Yeah,
and that's what we know. That at the same time as he was a Protestant or Lutheran Christian, he was very searching.
Yeah, and open-minded,
and very occupied with the idea, a notion of immortality.
Yeah.
Yes.
And also mixing a lot of pagan elements, as we've also discussed on the course, mixing a lot of pagan elements into these discussions without it being blasphemous. And touching bordering on blasphemy within a strict Lutheran sense. But then again, I don't think he wrote from this really dogmatic theological Lutheranism. On the contrary, he was experimenting a lot, trying a lot of things out, and working through a lot of theoretical debates through his texts, as we will definitely see this week with the Red Shoes.
Yeah. Well, we can get more questions. Yes. I read Hans Christian Andersen's. I'm sorry. I've read that Hans Christian Andersen overstates his welcome when visiting his friend Charles Dickens. Is it true? Is it false? He wrote a Christmas story for Dickens too. Therefore, he obviously admires Dickens' work. It is because we see this writing also like an entertainer, which we all know. So, you have a comment?
Yeah, about the Dickens thing. It's mostly hearsay. One of the course members had a really nice little presentation of it, and apparently, also I've heard, but this is completely unsubstantiated. I have heard before that he overstayed his visit with the Dickens family. But the more detailed version is that he apparently wrote to Dickens that he would only stay for a couple of days, and then he stayed for weeks. And apparently, because he wasn't so good at English, the communication somehow went wrong, and he didn't know that he was overstaying. And the Dickens had a lot of children who were annoyed by this Dane who couldn't really communicate with them. And then at the end, he was This is completely on a personal note, but I think that it's safe to say that he could get exhausting at times as a person. It's not the first time I've read that he has been exhausting to people.
No.
Or very, very sensitive and quite difficult. So I don't know if I should just leave it at that, but
maybe.
I think so.
And maybe we should take care not to overstay.
By our friends.
So should we call it a day, perhaps?
Yeah.
So, well, thank you to all of you who asked these brilliant questions, and thanks for watching or for viewing later if that is what you do. But thank you for now, and I hope you'll enjoy the remainder of the course.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.